Nora Ashford was wiping down the worn wooden table when four men in black suits walked into the small coffee shop. They scanned the room like they were appraising real estate, then one opened an expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "We need to speak with Miss Nora Ashford." His voice was cold but respectful. She looked toward the familiar corner chair where Harrison had sat every morning for 3 years, where she'd always brought him black coffee and a donut, even though he never paid in full. Now the chair sat empty, and these men were looking at her like she'd just become someone completely different. Sometimes the smallest kindness can rewrite a life. If stories like this move, you don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment on what you'd have done in her place. The morning rain drummed against Fletcher's corner cafe windows, casting shifting shadows across worn linoleum floors. Nora Ashford pushed through the kitchen doors, coffee pot in hand, steam coiling upward, catching the cold morning light. The familiar weight of the pot anchored her to this routine 6 a.m. sharp, same as every weekday for the past 4 years. Her sneakers squeaked against the damp floor as she navigated between mismatched tables, each one carrying the stories of 1,000 conversations. Outside Portland's downtown was just beginning to stir delivery trucks rumbling past, while early commuters hurried by with hunched shoulders. "Table 7 needs a refill," Iris Fletcher called from behind the register, not looking up from counting yesterday's drawer. The owner's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, sorting bills into neat stacks. "And that corner booth is asking for more cream. The construction workers from the Morrison Bridge project, they go through cream like it's going out of style." Iris had been running Fletcher's Corner for 26 years and had seen every kind of hard luck story Portland's downtown could offer. The cafe was her kingdom, small but fiercely protected, a sanctuary for working people who needed coffee strong enough to fuel 12-hour shifts. Nora nodded, already moving toward the back corner where Harrison Dunbar sat hunched over yesterday's newspaper. His thin shoulders curved inward like parentheses around some private story, and his fingers clean but calloused in a way that spoke of work she couldn't quite place, traced the headlines without really reading. The same black coffee sat cooling in front of him, barely touched, as if the ritual of having it mattered more than the drinking. He carried himself with the restraint of someone used to being underestimated, a faint glint of metal peeking from his vest. More habit than vanity. The morning light caught that silver chain, a detail that seemed incongruous with his careful maintenance of worn but clean clothes. "Morning, Harrison?" She set a fresh cup beside his elbow, replacing the cold one without ceremony. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead the way Iris made it for laborers who needed caffeine more than comfort. "Blueberry muffin today. Mrs. Loran brought them fresh from her bakery down the street. Still warm, if you can believe it." She watched his face for the familiar flicker of want and restraint, the careful calculation of someone who'd learned to measure desires against empty pockets. His eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held a sharpness that suggested intelligence, carefully banked. He glanced up, those pale blue eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine warmth. "That's kind of you, Miss Nora, but you know I'm a little short this week." His voice carried traces of something refined, like expensive whiskey watered down, but not completely diluted. The accent was hard to place. Not quite Boston, not quite somewhere else, but definitely educated. Sometimes she caught glimpses of the man he might have been before whatever circumstances had brought him to her corner table. "Perhaps next week, when my situation improves." He said it with the same quiet hope he'd expressed countless mornings running. "Don't worry about it." She pulled the day-old muffin from her apron pocket, wrapped in a paper napkin with care that elevated the simple gesture into something meaningful. This one was getting lonely anyway. Would have just gone stale if someone didn't give it a purpose. It was their dance, this careful preservation of dignity wrapped in practical kindness. She'd learned to frame these moments as solutions to problems rather than charity, letting him maintain pride while accepting help. In a place where routine mattered more than reasons, nobody asked too many questions. Harrison's fingers closed around the muffin with careful reverence. "You're too good for an old fool like me." The words came out rougher than usual, as if emotion had caught him off guard. He unwrapped the muffin slowly, methodically, the way someone might handle a precious gift. "Your kindness means more than you know, Miss Nora. In a world that often forgets to see people like me, You've made me feel human again." He broke off a small piece and ate it with deliberate appreciation, closing his eyes briefly as if committing the taste to memory. "Iris doesn't mind." Nora lied smoothly, knowing full well her boss had opinions about their arrangement. "Besides, everyone deserves a warm breakfast. That's what my grandmother used to say, you can't pour from an empty cup." She watched Harrison's careful movements, the way he made the small muffin last, taking tiny bites and chewing thoughtfully. There was something almost ceremonial about it, as if he was teaching himself to find richness in simplicity. "We're all just trying to get through the day with a little grace, right?" She moved to refill other tables, her practiced eye cataloging the needs of regular customers: extra sugar for the postal worker, decaf for the retired teacher, strong and black for the construction crew. But her attention kept drifting back to Harrison's corner. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the way he held his coffee cup, like crystal, the careful pronunciation that suggested education, the intensity with which he watched the morning news, as if the business reports affected him personally. His hands were clean but marked with old calluses, and sometimes she caught him adjusting his watch chain with unconscious precision. "Nora." Iris appeared at her elbow, lowering her voice to that particular register reserved for difficult conversations. "We need to talk about your charity project over there." She glanced meaningfully toward Harrison's corner, her face wearing the expression of someone wrestling with practical concerns and human compassion. "I'm not heartless, you know. But running a business means making hard choices sometimes." Her tone carried the weight of 26 years of similar decisions, each one a small moral calculation. "He's a good man, Iris. Just down on his luck." Nora kept her voice steady, though she could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that came with defending something important. "He never causes trouble, never complains, always says thank you. And sometimes he does pay in full when he can." She thought of the days when Harrison arrived with exact change, the pride in his bearing on those mornings when his circumstances aligned with his dignity. "That tab of his is pushing $200. But Iris's voice lacked real bite, the protest more habitual than heartfelt. She'd long ago accepted that some debts belonged to the heart, not the ledger. Her own parents had immigrated with nothing and had depended on the kindness of strangers who saw potential where others saw only need. "I'm not saying cut him off, just be careful. Sometimes being too kind makes you a target. And sometimes people are carrying stories that could complicate your life in ways you never expected." Nora glanced back at Harrison, who was carefully adjusting his watch chain with the same precision he brought to everything else. When he stood to leave, he straightened his shoulders and nodded to her with old-world courtesy, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge not just her service but her humanity. Something in his bearing just for that moment looked almost regal, like someone accustomed to different circumstances maintaining dignity despite fallen fortune. "Same time tomorrow, Harrison, if you'll have me, Miss Nora." And he paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and turned back with an expression that seemed to hold more gratitude than coffee and a muffin should warrant. "And thank you for seeing me." The words carried weight, as if being seen, really seen, was a gift rarer than money or food. His voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "You've made me feel human again, and that's worth more than you know." The words hit her like a physical force, and Nora found herself standing still after the door closed behind him. Outside, Harrison walked past the window with measured steps, his coat collar turned up against the continuing drizzle. For just a second in profile against the gray morning light, something about his bearing looked almost familiar. Then she noticed something new. For the first time, she saw the faint imprint of a ring on his finger, one that hadn't been there last week. The impression lasted only a moment before he disappeared around the corner, leaving her with the strange feeling that she was missing something important. "Dreamer," Iris muttered, but not unkindly. "You always were too soft for your own good. Even as a kid, bringing home stray cats and broken birds, thinking love could fix everything." She began wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. "But maybe the world needs more dreamers. Just promise me you'll be smart about it. Kindness is beautiful, but naive kindness can be dangerous." Maybe so, Nora thought, as she tucked the unpaid receipt into their running tab drawer and wiped down Harrison's table. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than simple charity. The way he read the business section with particular intensity, the careful way he spoke about city politics, the unconscious authority in his voice when he offered opinions on local development, all of it suggested a past more complex than his present circumstances revealed. Sometimes she caught him staring out the window with an expression that looked less like resignation and more like strategy, as if he was waiting for something that hadn't yet arrived. And now, there was that ring mark, fresh as if he'd only recently stopped wearing whatever had left that impression. She folded his newspaper neatly and placed it back on the table, ready for tomorrow's ritual. But the simple gesture felt different now, weighted with questions she couldn't yet articulate. The snow had been falling for 2 days straight that February morning when Harrison Dunbar first walked through Fletcher's corner doors. Nora remembered because the city had been paralyzed, buses running hours late and half the downtown shops closed until the plows could clear the streets. She'd been alone in the cafe, Iris having called in sick with the flu, when the bell chimed, and this thin man in a threadbare coat shuffled inside, shaking snow from his shoulders. He'd stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, studying the menu board as if memorizing it, his pale eyes moving across the prices with the careful attention of someone doing mental arithmetic. His shoes, leather Oxfords that must have cost serious money once, were resoled with rubber that didn't quite match. Every detail about him carried the quiet stubbornness of someone refusing to vanish completely, maintaining dignity through sheer force of will. "Just coffee, please," he'd said when he finally approached the counter, his voice carrying that same refined accent she'd come to know. "Black, large if you don't mind." His hands emerged from deep pockets, counting quarters and dimes with focused concentration. She watched him stack the change on the counter, 47 cents when the coffee cost 95. The silence stretched between them while he recounted, his fingers trembling slightly. That was the morning she'd bent a small rule without realizing it would define the next 3 years. "Register's acting up today." She'd lied smoothly, scooping up his coins. She'd filled the largest cup they had and slid it across the counter. The relief that flickered across his face was so brief she almost missed it, quickly replaced by careful dignity that suggested he wasn't used to accepting charity but recognized kindness when offered with grace. "Thank you," he'd said, simply wrapping both hands around the cup. "I'm Harrison Dunbar." The name had sounded familiar somehow, though she couldn't place where she might have heard it before, a half-remembered echo from some other context that danced just beyond reach. "Nora Ashford, and you're welcome here anytime, Mr. Dunbar." She gestured toward the tables. "Find yourself a spot and stay as long as you like." He'd chosen the corner table that first day, too, settling into the chair with his back to the wall where he could watch the room and street through the windows. Something about the choice felt tactical, the instinct of someone accustomed to monitoring his environment. For the first few weeks, Harrison had been punctual but distant, arriving each morning at exactly 7:15 and leaving by 8, nursing that single cup with the discipline of someone stretching resources. He'd bring his own newspaper, not bought fresh, but probably rescued from bus benches or office lobbies, the pages already showing creases from previous readers. Sometimes he'd pull a small notebook from his pocket and make careful entries in handwriting so precise it looked like calligraphy, though he always closed it before anyone could see what he was documenting. The breakthrough had come in March during one of those surprise late winter storms. Harrison had arrived without his usual newspaper, and Nora had noticed him sitting empty-handed, staring out at the sleet with an expression dangerously close to defeat. She'd grabbed Iris's copy of the Oregonian from behind the counter and set it beside his coffee without a word. "Business section's interesting today," she'd said casually, flipping to the financial pages. She'd watched his eyes sharpen as they moved across the headlines about riverfront development, his finger tracing articles with attention that seemed more professional than casual. When he'd started commenting about location and timing with unexpected authority, she'd realized this wasn't just a man who read the news, this was someone who'd once lived it. "Used to work in real estate." The question had slipped out, and she'd immediately regretted it when she saw his face close off. But then something shifted, and he'd given her a small, sad smile. "Something like that," he'd said. "A long time ago now. Different life." He'd spent decades overseeing construction bids. Those details never left a man. "Thank you for sharing this. Information is a luxury I can't always afford these days." That had become their routine, Nora sharing the day's paper, Harrison offering quiet commentary that revealed depths of knowledge about city politics and development projects that seemed far beyond what his circumstances should allow. She'd learned to listen for moments when his careful reserve slipped and glimpses of his former self emerged through the cracks in his current facade. By summer, the coffee debt had grown steadily. Iris had started making pointed comments about their charity case, but Nora had also noticed her boss occasionally slipping Harrison an extra muffin or pretending not to see when he lingered past closing time during hot afternoons when the cafe's air conditioning offered relief from the street. "He's got good manners," Iris had admitted one busy morning after Harrison had helped an elderly customer with her heavy bags without being asked. "And he never makes trouble." She'd paused, watching Harrison straighten his place setting before leaving. "There's something about him, though. Something that doesn't add up. Man knows too much for someone living hand to mouth." Nora had noticed it too, the way Harrison's eyes tracked delivery trucks servicing nearby construction sites, noting which companies were working which projects with the sharp attention of an expert evaluating quality. The casual way he'd mentioned that the new office building on 3rd Street was using substandard materials and would probably fail inspection. The morning he'd quietly suggested she avoid walking past the old Morrison building because the sidewalk repairs weren't up to code and someone was going to get hurt. She'd thought he was just observant until a week later, when exactly what he'd predicted happened. A chunk of concrete had fallen from the building's facade, crushing the sidewalk where pedestrians regularly walked. The city had shut down the whole block for emergency repairs, and Harrison had simply nodded when she'd mentioned it, as if he'd been waiting for the inevitable. "How did you know?" she'd asked, and he'd given her that careful smile that had become so familiar. "When you've overseen enough construction projects, you learn to recognize the shortcuts that cause problems later." His voice had carried the weight of professional experience rather than casual observation, decades of expertise compressed into offhand remarks. "Most people don't look close enough to see the warning signs. I spent 30 years making sure I did." There had been other moments like that, prescient observations about city council decisions, quiet predictions about which local businesses would succeed or fail based on foot traffic patterns and lease negotiations he seemed to understand intimately. Each revelation had added another piece to the puzzle of who Harrison Dunbar really was, though the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. The debt ledger now showed $193.47, the slow accumulation of small mercies over 3 years, written in Nora's careful handwriting in a composition notebook she kept beneath the register. Some days Harrison managed to pay in full, arriving with exact change and quiet pride that made those moments feel like victories for both of them. Other days he came up short, and she'd make excuses about the register or claim the muffins needed to be moved anyway, preserving his dignity while extending grace. But lately, she'd noticed changes that had nothing to do with money. The way he'd started checking his pocket watch more frequently, as if timing something or waiting for a specific moment that was approaching with mathematical precision. The careful attention he paid to the calendar behind the counter, his eyes tracking the date with intensity that seemed to carry significance beyond simple timekeeping. Yesterday, she'd caught him writing what looked like a letter in his notebook, his handwriting more hurried than usual before quickly closing it when another customer approached. "Same time tomorrow, Harrison?" she'd asked as he prepared to leave that morning, the question carrying the weight of routine and unspoken concern that had developed over months of shared mornings. "Yes," he'd said, but something in his voice had sounded different. Finally, somehow like a man completing a long-term plan rather than simply agreeing to tomorrow's coffee. "Same time tomorrow, Miss Nora. And thank you for everything." The words had carried more emotion than usual, and he'd paused at the door longer than normal, looking back at the corner table, as if memorizing details he might not see again. Now, 24 hours later, that table sat empty for the first time in months, and Nora found herself checking the clock every few minutes, her stomach tight with worry that had no rational explanation. Harrison Dunbar might owe them nearly $200, but he'd never missed a morning without warning. In 3 years of routine as reliable as sunrise, his absence felt less like lateness and more like an ending she hadn't seen coming. She wiped down his table for the 3rd time that morning, straightening the sugar dispenser with movements that had become a nervous habit. Outside, the morning crowd hurried past in their usual patterns, but the rhythm felt fundamentally broken without Harrison's familiar presence anchoring the corner of her world. Something significant had shifted overnight, though she couldn't yet understand what or why. She didn't know it yet, but that empty chair would soon draw more attention than it ever had when occupied. 7:15 came and went without Harrison's familiar silhouette appearing through the rain-streaked windows. Nora found herself glancing toward the door every few minutes, a coffee pot growing heavy in her hands as she made unnecessary rounds to tables that didn't need refilling. That corner seat, too bright and too empty, now seemed to stare back at her with an accusation she couldn't name. "He'll show," Iris said from behind the register, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. "Maybe the weather's got him holed up somewhere. Streets are pretty rough out there." The rain outside felt heavier without him, each drop against the glass marking time that stretched uncomfortably long. But Nora knew better. Harrison had walked through worse weather than this, had never let rain or snow keep him from his morning ritual. In 3 years, he'd missed exactly 2 days, once when downtown had been evacuated for a gas leak and once during the flu epidemic. Both times he'd apologized profusely when he returned, as if his absence had somehow disrupted the natural order of their small world. By 8 o'clock, when Harrison's chair should have been empty and his newspaper folded neatly, Nora's worry had crystallized into something approaching panic. She caught herself staring at the corner table, willing his thin frame to materialize from the morning gloom. Instead, a construction worker in muddy boots claimed the spot spreading blueprints across the surface where Harrison's careful hands usually traced headlines with the precision of someone reading scripture. "Maybe he finally found work, suggested Tommy, one of their regulars who drove a bus for the city. "Lots of guys his age are having to come out of retirement these days. The economy's got everyone scrambling." He stirred sugar into his coffee with mechanical efficiency. "Could be he got a gig that starts early, can't make it in here anymore." The possibility should have been comforting, but something felt fundamentally wrong. Harrison had never mentioned looking for work, had never displayed the restless energy of someone actively seeking employment. His daily routine had the settled quality of someone who'd made peace with his circumstances, who'd found stability in small rituals rather than grand gestures. During the lunch rush, Nora found herself asking other regulars if they'd seen Harrison around the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson from the library shook her head but promised to keep an eye out. The postal worker said he'd noticed fewer people on his route lately, the weather keeping the usual street crowd indoors. But none of them could remember seeing Harrison anywhere except his usual corner, as if he existed only within the confines of Fletcher's Corner, materializing each morning and vanishing into the city's anonymous crowds. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon when Nora finally admitted something was genuinely wrong. Harrison wasn't late, wasn't sick, wasn't dealing with some temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself tomorrow. His absence felt permanent in a way that made her chest tight with inexplicable dread, as if some essential piece of the cafe's daily rhythm had been surgically removed. She was wiping down tables during the brief lull between lunch and dinner when the television mounted in the corner caught her attention. The local news was running a story about a prominent businessman who died unexpectedly, and something about the cadence of the reporter's voice made her stop cleaning and turn toward the screen. Harrison Dunbar. The reclusive real estate mogul was found dead yesterday morning. The 73-year-old had been living quietly after selling his company. The coffee mug slipped from Nora's nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor in an explosion of ceramic and cold coffee. The sound seemed to echo in sudden silence. Though she realized dimly that the silence was only in her head, other customers continued their conversations, oblivious to the bombshell that had just detonated her understanding of the last 3 years. Harrison Dunbar. The name she'd been hearing every morning spoken in that refined voice that carried traces of education and authority. The same Harrison Dunbar who'd been carefully measuring coins like time itself, who owed them nearly $200, who'd sat reading day-old newspapers and making observations about construction projects with expertise that had always seemed oddly specific. "Jesus, Nora, what happened?" Iris appeared with a dustpan and broom, kneeling to collect scattered pieces. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "The news," Nora managed, pointing toward the television where the story had already moved on to weather forecasts. "Did you hear that name, Harrison Dunbar?" Iris looked up from the broken ceramic, her weathered face creasing with concern. What about him? Some rich guy died, right? She paused the dustpan halfway to the trash, and Nora watched understanding dawn slowly across her features. Wait, Harrison Dunbar. Our Harrison? That's him. That's our Harrison. The man who's been sitting in that corner booth every morning for 3 years. For a moment, Iris just stared, her mouth slightly open, as if the words hadn't quite reached her brain yet. Then disbelief flickered across her face, followed by the kind of shock that comes when reality suddenly rearranges itself into an entirely new pattern. That can't be right, she said weakly, sinking into the nearest chair. Our Harrison is broken, living on handouts. Real estate moguls don't count quarters to pay for coffee. But even as she said it, the pieces were clicking into place for both of them. That quiet authority in his tone she'd mistaken for habit, the uncanny knowledge of city politics and development projects. The way he'd predicted which buildings would have problems, which businesses would fail, which city council decisions would affect local commerce. That quiet pride money could neither buy nor erase the bearing that had always seemed incongruous with his circumstances. He was hiding, Nora said, realizing hitting her with the force of revelation. Living like he had nothing when he actually had millions. But why would someone worth that much sit in our cafe every morning pretending to be broke? His company had relocated, his photos long vanished from business sections. Anonymity was easier than she'd thought. The question hung between them like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about human nature and motivation. Rich people were supposed to be different, weren't they? Supposed to live in glass towers and drive expensive cars and drink coffee that cost more than their hourly wage. They weren't supposed to shuffle through snow in resoled shoes, carefully rationing their dignity along with their quarters. But Nora was remembering yesterday's goodbye, the finality in Harrison's voice, when he'd thanked her for everything. The way he'd looked back at the corner table as if memorizing it, the emotion that had seemed too heavy for a simple "see you tomorrow." Had he known this was coming? Had he been saying goodbye, not just to the morning, but to the entire carefully constructed identity he'd been maintaining? As closing time approached and the corner table remained empty, Nora found herself staring at the composition notebook where she'd recorded Harrison's accumulated debt. $193.47, the price of 3 years of kindness, of treating a stranger with dignity when he'd seemed to have nothing left to offer in return. Except now it appeared he'd had everything to offer, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, he'd chosen their modest cafe, accepting charity from a waitress who lived paycheck to paycheck. The revelation should have made her angry, should have felt like a betrayal of trust. Instead, it felt like the opening chapter of a story she was only just beginning to understand. Tomorrow, she decided she'd find out who he really was, and why he'd chosen her cafe for his exile. They entered like a verdict being delivered, sharp, silent, and final. Nora was refilling the napkin dispensers when she heard the door chime, followed by the particular kind of silence that falls when expensive suits walk into working-class spaces. The lead figure was tall and silver-haired, with a commanding presence that suggested courtrooms rather than coffee shops. Behind him, 3 younger men formed a precise formation, each carrying identical briefcases. "We're looking for Miss Nora Ashford," the silver-haired man announced, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. The entire cafe seemed to pause, customers glancing up to stare at this unexpected intrusion of corporate authority. Nora felt her stomach drop. These men weren't here for coffee. They were here for her specifically, and something about their formal bearing suggested this wasn't going to be pleasant. "That's me," she said, setting down the napkin holder with hands that had suddenly developed a slight tremor. "I'm Bennett Crawford, senior partner at Crawford, Mitchell & Associates." The man stepped forward, extending an expensive business card. "We represent the estate of Harrison Dunbar, and we need to speak with you about a matter of considerable importance. Mr. Dunbar's will explicitly required personal delivery, insisting the setting remain unchanged." The words rearranged her understanding of the world. Estate, Harrison Dunbar. She was dimly aware of Iris emerging from the kitchen, her face creased with concern. "Is there somewhere private we could talk?" Crawford continued, his eyes moving around the cafe with polite distaste. "Whatever you need to say, you can say it here," Nora managed. This was her workplace, her territory, and if they had business with her, they could conduct it on her terms. Crawford exchanged glances with his colleagues, then opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, removing a thick folder bound in legal blue. Very well. Miss Ashford, are you familiar with the name Harrison Dunbar? I knew Harrison Dunbar, yes. He was a regular customer here for about 3 years. I heard on the news that he passed away. Indeed. Mr. Dunbar died 2 days ago in his apartment. Crawford's voice carried the particular tone lawyers used when delivering life-changing information. What you may not know is that Mr. Dunbar was one of Portland's most successful real estate developers with a personal net worth exceeding $50 million. Even the espresso machine seemed to hesitate. 50 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like discussing the distance to stars. I don't understand, she said weakly. The Harrison I knew didn't have money. He could barely afford coffee most days. Mr. Dunbar lived very simply in his final years by choice. He seems to have been conducting some sort of social experiment, observing how people treated him when they believed he had nothing to offer. The word stung with implications. Social experiment. As if the last 3 years had been some elaborate test she hadn't known she was taking. Why are you telling me this? Crawford opened the folder with theatrical precision. Because Miss Ashford, Mr. Dunbar has named you as a primary beneficiary in his last will and testament. He has left you the sum of $2.7 million, roughly 5% of his estate, along with specific instructions regarding its intended use. Her legs felt suddenly unsteady. She groped for the nearest chair, sinking into it while trying to process this fundamental reorganization of reality. That's not possible, she whispered. I barely knew him. I was just being kind to someone who seemed to need kindness. According to his letter of instruction, that's exactly why he chose you. Crawford produced another document handwritten in Harrison's precise script. He states, Miss Ashford demonstrated consistent compassion and dignity in her treatment of me over 3 years. She asked for nothing in return and never made me feel like a burden. I want her to have resources to continue being the person she is without financial constraints. Before Nora could respond, the cafe door burst open again. The woman was middle-aged and expensively dressed, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than Nora made in a month. The man beside her wore a suit that managed to look both expensive and predatory. They'd followed the firm's car from the parking garage, unwilling to wait for formal notice. Mr. Crawford, the woman called across the cafe, her voice carrying inherited authority. I hope you haven't proceeded without us. Crawford's professional composure flickered. Ms. Dunbar, Mr. Dunbar, I didn't expect you quite so soon. These were Harrison's children, the family members who had expected to inherit everything and who had just discovered that a waitress was walking away with nearly $3 million. The woman, Cordelia, fixed her with a stare that could have flash-frozen coffee. So this is the woman who manipulated our father. Did you know who he was from the beginning, or did you figure it out along the way? I didn't know anything, Nora protested, rising from her chair. I thought he was homeless. I was just trying to be decent. Decent, the man Reginald repeated with humorless laughter. 3 years of calculated manipulation playing on an old man's loneliness. Very decent indeed. The injustice sparked something fierce in Nora's chest. These people were accusing her of manipulating their father for money she'd never known existed. I never asked him for anything, she said, her voice growing stronger with anger. When he couldn't pay, I covered it because I'm not going to let someone go hungry if I can help it. Cordelia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We're contesting this will. Our father was clearly not in his right mind. The will is perfectly legal, Crawford replied stiffly. Your father was examined by 3 separate physicians. All confirmed his mental competence. We're prepared to offer you a settlement, Cordelia said. $200,000 cash in exchange for renouncing any claim to our father's estate. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. $200,000 more money than Nora had ever imagined having. But it was also an admission that they considered her claim legitimate enough to buy her off. No, she said simply. No. Cordelia repeated as if the word were foreign. No. If your father wanted me to have this money, then I'm going to honor his wishes. I'm not going to let you bully me into giving up something that isn't yours to begin with. This isn't over. Reginald said, his voice carrying a threat wrapped in legal language. "We'll see you in court, Miss Ashford." They swept out with the same dramatic authority they'd brought in. Crawford gathered his papers but handed Nora a business card and thick envelope. "You'll need legal counsel, Miss Ashford. The Dunbars have significant resources and considerable motivation." After they left, the cafe erupted into excited conversation. Nora stood holding an envelope that contained more money than she'd ever dreamed of. He would have hated the spectacle, but the universe had a cruel sense of irony. She thought about Harrison's empty corner table, about 3 years of morning coffee and small kindnesses. Kindness, it turned out, carried compound interest she'd never intended to collect. She gripped the counter as the room tilted slightly, realizing her simple life had just become infinitely more complicated. She didn't know it yet, but saying no had just declared a war she wasn't ready for. The building smelled of wealth and old agreements, the kind that had outlived their signers. Nora felt underdressed in her best jeans and sweater as she followed Bennett Crawford through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced partners from decades past. Her sneakers whispered against polished floors that probably cost more per square foot than she made in a month. "Mr. Dunbar was very specific about the timing of this meeting," Crawford explained as they walked. "It was written directly into the execution clause of his will. You needed 48 hours to process the initial information before receiving these additional materials." He paused outside a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. He seemed to understand that this would be overwhelming. The conference room contained a single manila envelope placed precisely in the center of a mahogany table. Beside it sat a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by age and handling. The deliberate staging made her pulse quicken with anticipation. These items were in Mr. Dunbar's personal safe, Crawford said, settling into a chair across from her. "You have 30 days under Oregon probate law to sign acceptance of the inheritance." Nora reached for the envelope, noting how the silence seemed to amplify every small sound, paper crinkling, her own breathing, the distant hum of traffic below. Her name was written across the front in handwriting that felt like him, measured, elegant, and impossible to rush. Inside, she found a single sheet of expensive paper and a smaller envelope marked "For later." The envelope was sealed in wax, old-fashioned, deliberate, unmistakably personal. The letter began simply, "Dear Miss Nora, if you're reading this, then Bennett has done his job, and you now know who I really was during our 3 years of shared mornings. I imagine you're feeling confused, perhaps even betrayed, and I want you to understand that was never my intention. 5 years ago, I sold my company and found myself with more money than any reasonable person could spend in several lifetimes. I also found myself profoundly lonely. My children had long since made it clear that they were more interested in my bank account than my company. My social circle consisted entirely of people who wanted something from me. I began to wonder if anyone would care about Harrison Dunbar, the person, rather than Harrison Dunbar, the fortune. So I conducted an experiment. I rented a modest apartment, dressed simply, and began spending time in places where wealthy men don't typically venture. I wanted to see how people would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer. Most ignored me completely. Some were kind in passing, but moved on quickly when it became clear I couldn't reciprocate their generosity. A few were actively cruel, as if poverty were contagious. But you, Miss Nora, were different. You saw me as a human being worth caring about, even when you believed I was just another down-on-his-luck old man. You never made me feel like a burden or an object of pity. You treated me with dignity when I had no apparent reason to deserve it. This is why I've chosen you to receive this bequest. Not because you need the money, though I suspect you do, but because you've proven yourself to be the kind of person who will use it well. I'm not asking you to become wealthy. I'm asking you to become a force for the kind of kindness you showed me. The money comes with one condition: it must be used to help others in the same spirit you helped me. Start small if you wish. Expand Fletcher's Corner. Hire more staff, provide jobs for people who need them. Or think bigger. The choice is yours, but the money must serve others, not just yourself. In the wooden box, you'll find a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Inside that box are documents that will help you understand the full scope of what I'm asking you to undertake. I know my children will fight this will. They've been preparing for my death like vultures circling a carcass, and they won't accept losing what they consider their birthright to someone they've never met. Be strong, Miss Nora. The law is on your side, and more importantly, you're in the right. Thank you for 3 years of coffee conversation and the restoration of my faith in human decency. Use this gift well. With deepest gratitude and respect, Harrison Dunbar. Nora set the letter down, her heartbeat loud in the sudden quiet. The wooden box felt warm under her fingers as she lifted its lid, revealing a brass key attached to a chain and a small item wrapped in tissue paper. The key was substantial, the kind that suggested vaults and secrets rather than simple storage. She unwrapped the tissue paper carefully, revealing Harrison's pocket watch, the watch that had marked every minute of their strange friendship. It was heavier than she'd expected, its silver case engraved with initials and a date, HD 1975, for service above and beyond. The inscription suggested this had been a gift for some achievement she'd never know about. "He wanted you to have that," Crawford said quietly. "He said it was the only material possession that had ever truly mattered to him, and he thought you'd understand why." Nora turned the watch over in her hand, feeling the weight of 47 years of memories she hadn't shared. This had been with Harrison through decades of success and failure, through whatever circumstances had led him to Fletcher's corner and their unlikely friendship. "What happens next?" she asked. "That depends on you," Crawford replied. "You have 30 days to make your final decision. If you accept the bequest, we'll begin the process of transferring the funds. If you decline, the money reverts to the estate. And if I accept, then you'll need to prepare for a fight. Cordelia and Reginald Dunbar have already retained Bartholomew Ashworth, one of the city's most aggressive litigation attorneys. They wasted no time. The filing hit the court docket this morning. They're claiming undue influence, diminished capacity fraud. It could take months or years to resolve. The prospect of years-long legal battles sent a chill through her. She was a waitress who'd never been inside a courtroom, facing off against people who'd grown up with lawyers on speed dial. The smart thing would be to take their settlement offer and walk away. But something about Harrison's letter, about the deliberate way he'd planned this sequence of events, made walking away feel like betrayal. He'd spent 3 years observing her character, testing her responses, evaluating whether she could be trusted. The weight of that trust sat heavy in her chest, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. The moral mathematics felt impossible. Accept, and she'd be claiming she deserved millions for simply being decent to an old man. Decline, and she'd be abandoning whatever larger purpose Harrison had seen in her. Either choice felt like hubris. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Of course. Take 30 days. Visit the safety deposit box when you're ready. And Miss Ashford..." Crawford's voice carried something that might have been admiration. "For what it's worth, I think Harrison chose well." As Nora walked back through downtown Portland, the for later envelope tucked safely in her jacket beside the key, she realized that accepting this inheritance wouldn't just change her life, it would define who she really was. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out. The watch ticked against her pulse, a reminder that every second forward was a choice she could never unmake. The Portland Central Library's law section smelled like old paper and abandoned dreams. Nora sat at a scarred wooden table surrounded by legal texts that might as well have been written in ancient Greek, trying to decode the language that would determine her future. A week into her 30-day deadline, she'd been coming here every morning, arriving when the doors opened at 9, and staying until her shift at Fletcher's corner began. By now, her notebooks had turned the incomprehensible into her own rough language of survival. Testamentary capacity meant Harrison had to be mentally sound when he wrote the will. Undue influence meant someone had to prove she'd manipulated him. Burden of proof meant his children had to prove their accusations, not the other way around. She'd printed sample petitions tracing how real lawyers built arguments from facts and precedent. The reference librarian, Mrs. Loran, had helped her navigate the legal maze, though she'd warned early on that self-representation in a contested will case was like performing surgery on yourself. The irony wasn't lost on Nora. She was potentially inheriting millions, but couldn't afford to fight for them. The more she learned, the more confident she became that Harrison had planned carefully. His will was straightforward and specific. He'd undergone medical examinations that confirmed his mental competence. Most importantly, he'd left detailed written explanations that made his reasoning clear and rational. But confidence in the law was different from confidence in herself. Every time she imagined standing in a courtroom facing Bartholomew Ashworth's team of expensive lawyers, her stomach clenched with panic. "Research is good," said a voice behind her, "but you'll need more than books to win this fight." Nora turned to find a man in his 50s watching her from the next table. He was dressed simply jeans, flannel shirt, reading glasses, but something about his bearing suggested authority. He'd been sitting there for an hour, occasionally glancing at her growing pile of legal texts. "I'm sorry." "David Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "Retired attorney. Bar number long retired, but the instincts are still sharp. Couldn't help but notice you're diving into probate law with the enthusiasm of someone who's about to need it." His smile was warm but knowing. "Mind if I ask what kind of case you're preparing for?" Nora hesitated. The last week had taught her to be wary of strangers. Reporters had tried calling the cafe. Neighbors had suddenly become interested in her personal life. But something about David's straightforward manner put her at ease. "A will contest," she said carefully. "Someone left me something, and their family doesn't think I deserve it." David nodded knowingly. "Ah, family versus outsider. Those are always ugly. How much legal experience do you have?" "None whatsoever." "And you're planning to represent yourself?" "I can't afford not to." David was quiet for a moment, studying her with careful attention. Finally, he seemed to reach a conclusion. "Tell you what," he said. "I've got some time on my hands, and I've always been a sucker for David versus Goliath stories. What would you say to some unofficial mentoring? I can't represent you, no active license, but I can teach you how to think like a lawyer." The offer felt too good to be true. "Why would you do that?" "Because I spent 30 years watching rich people use the legal system to crush anyone who threatened their sense of entitlement. Sometimes I helped those rich men do it back when I still believed the system was fair." His voice carried old regret. "And because you remind me of my daughter, stubborn enough to take on impossible odds." Over the next 2 hours, David walked her through the real world of will contests. He explained how Bartholomew Ashworth would likely approach the case, what strategies the Dunbar siblings would probably employ, and how she could counter their arguments with limited resources. "They'll try to paint you as a gold digger who manipulated a lonely old man," he said, making notes in her margins. "So you need evidence of your character. Witnesses who can testify to your relationship with Harrison. Documentation that shows you weren't motivated by money." "What about Harrison's letter?" "It helps, but it's not enough. Letters can be forged, coerced, or written under duress. You need independent evidence that corroborates his version of events." David tapped his pen against the table. "Tell me about your relationship with him. How did it start? What was it like day to day?" For the next hour, Nora found herself reliving 3 years of morning coffee and small conversations. David listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that forced her to think about details she'd taken for granted. How has Harrison's demeanor changed over time? Has he ever mentioned his family? Were there witnesses to their interactions? "The beauty of your case," David said finally, "is that it happened in public. Every conversation, every cup of coffee, every unpaid bill, it all happened in front of other people. That's your strength. Harrison didn't choose you in private. He observed you interacting with the world, and the world can testify to what they saw." He showed her how to organize witness statements, how to request documents from Harrison's doctors, and how to present evidence that told a coherent story rather than just listing facts. By the time they finished, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced since this began, the sense that she might actually have a fighting chance. "One more thing," David said as they packed up. "Don't let them make you feel guilty about this. Harrison chose you for reasons that made sense to him. Honor that choice." Walking back to Fletcher's corner that afternoon, Nora felt the weight of Harrison's pocket watch in her jacket. She had 23 days left to make her decision, but for the first time since this began, she was starting to think she knew what Harrison would want her to choose. Knowledge, she realized, was its own kind of courage, quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous to people like the Dunbars. The courthouse loomed over downtown Portland, its columns worn smooth by rain and regret. Nora stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, clutching a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to her father, trying to remember why she'd chosen to fight instead of fold. David Martinez appeared at her elbow, carrying his own briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that belonged in courtrooms. "Remember," he said quietly, "you're not David fighting Goliath. You're the voice of a dead man's wishes. That's what gives you power in there." He would sit in the gallery, not at counsel's table retired, but present all the same. The probate courtroom was smaller than Nora had expected, wood-paneled and intimate in a way that made every whisper feel significant. Judge Evelyn Pierce presided from behind a massive oak bench, her silver hair pulled back severely, and her dark eyes missing nothing. It was a bench trial, no jury, just the quiet weight of one woman's judgment. Judge Pierce had granted her limited leave to question witnesses directly, an unusual accommodation that spoke to the case's unique circumstances. Bartholomew Ashworth commanded the opposite side of the courtroom like a general surveying a battlefield. Behind him sat Cordelia and Reginald Dunbar, their faces set in expressions of righteous indignation. The gallery was packed with faces she recognized from ordinary mornings, all of them holding their breath. "This case," Judge Pierce announced, "concerns the contested will of Harrison Edmund Dunbar, deceased, specifically the bequest of $2.7 million to Miss Nora Ashford. Mr. Ashworth, you may present the petitioner's arguments." Ashworth rose with theatrical precision, his opening statement delivered like a performance crafted for maximum impact. "Your Honor, this case represents a textbook example of undue influence perpetrated against a vulnerable elderly man by someone who systematically exploited his loneliness and cognitive decline for financial gain." He painted a picture of Harrison as an isolated, confused old man, easy prey for a calculating waitress who'd recognized his wealth and methodically manipulated him over 3 years. According to Ashworth's narrative, Nora had deliberately fostered dependence, created artificial intimacy, and gradually convinced Harrison that she was the only person who truly cared about him. "The evidence will show," Ashworth continued, "that Miss Ashford's supposed charity was nothing more than a sophisticated con game designed to separate my client's father from his money. She preyed on his vulnerability, isolated him from his family, and convinced him to leave her millions of dollars in exchange for coffee and conversation." When Ashworth finished, the courtroom felt heavy with accusations. Nora could feel the weight of his words against everything the gallery thought they knew about her character. Judge Pierce turned to Nora with an expression that revealed nothing. "Miss Ashford, you may present your response." Nora stood on legs that felt steadier than they had any right to be. David's coaching had prepared her for this moment, but standing in front of a judge who would determine Harrison's final wishes felt like the most important conversation of her life. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying more strength than she'd expected, "Mr. Ashworth wants you to believe that kindness is suspicious, that treating someone with dignity requires ulterior motives. But the evidence will show that Harrison Dunbar was exactly who he claimed to be, a man conducting a deliberate experiment to see if anyone would value him for himself rather than his money." She walked the judge through Harrison's own words, reading sections of his letter that explained his motivations and methodology. She presented medical records showing his mental competence, physician testimonies confirming his cognitive function, and bank records proving he'd lived modestly by choice rather than necessity. "Mr. Dunbar didn't leave me this money because I manipulated him," Nora continued. "He left it to me because I treated him exactly the same way I treat every customer who walks into Fletcher's Corner, with basic respect. The only difference is that he was secretly wealthy enough to do something about it." The witness testimony began with Iris Fletcher, who took the stand with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd spent decades reading people's true characters. Under Nora's careful questioning, Iris described 3 years of observations, how Harrison had always been treated as just another customer, how Nora's behavior extended to everyone regardless of their ability to pay, how their relationship had never seemed calculated or manipulative. "That girl's the same with everybody," Iris said firmly. "Rich, poor doesn't matter. She sees people as people, not as opportunities. Always has." Mrs. Loran from the library testified about Harrison's frequent visits, describing him as articulate, well-informed, and clearly in command of his faculties. Tommy the bus driver talked about Harrison's obvious intelligence and the respect he'd shown for Nora's character. Customer after customer took the stand to describe a woman whose consideration was routine, not performance. But it was Dr. Margaret Walsh Harrison's personal physician whose testimony proved most damaging to the Dunbar case. Under oath, she revealed that Harrison had specifically discussed his social experiment during medical appointments, describing his methodology and his growing respect for Nora's character. Mr. Dunbar was conducting what he called field research on human nature, Dr. Walsh testified. He was fascinated by Miss Ashford's consistent behavior toward him. He said she was the only person in 3 years who treated him with dignity without knowing he could reward her for it. Ashworth's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to suggest that Dr. Walsh had been influenced by Harrison's wealth, that the witnesses were biased in Nora's favor, that the medical evaluations had been superficial. But each attack only reinforced the strength of Harrison's planning and the authenticity of his relationships. When Cordelia Dunbar took the stand, her testimony backfired spectacularly. Under Ashworth's friendly questioning, she painted herself as a devoted daughter who'd been cruelly surprised by her father's betrayal. But Nora's cross-examination, guided by David's whispered coaching, revealed the truth about the Dunbar family dynamics. "When did you last have dinner with your father, Miss Dunbar?" Nora asked. We had busy schedules, but we spoke regularly." "How regularly? Once a week, once a month?" Cordelia's hesitation was damning. "We maintained contact. Ms. Dunbar, according to your father's phone records, you called him exactly 4 times in the year before his death. All 4 calls lasted less than 5 minutes. Does that sound like regular contact to you?" The pattern that emerged was devastating to the Dunbar case. Years of neglect, perfunctory holiday visits, phone calls that focused on business rather than relationship. Harrison's children had treated him exactly like what Ashworth accused Nora of, being people interested in his money rather than his company. Reginald's testimony was even worse. He'd actually asked his father for loans multiple times, had suggested Harrison move to a retirement community so they could manage his assets, and had openly discussed their inheritance expectations with estate planning attorneys while Harrison was still alive. By the time the evidence phase concluded, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a David versus Goliath story had revealed itself to be something simpler and sadder, a lonely father's decision to reward the only person who genuinely cared about his company rather than his wealth. In her closing argument, Nora spoke directly to Judge Pierce about the nature of authentic relationships and the price of genuine care. Harrison Dunbar spent 3 years learning something his own children never bothered to discover: that consideration given freely without expectation of reward is the rarest and most valuable gift one person can offer another. This bequest isn't about money, Your Honor. It's about a man's final attempt to ensure that goodness gets rewarded in a world that too often punishes it. Ashworth's closing was technically proficient, but emotionally hollow. A recitation of legal precedents that felt disconnected from the human story that had unfolded over 3 days of testimony. Judge Pierce retired to consider her decision. 17 minutes that stretched like hours before the door opened, and she returned. "The court finds," she announced, "that Harrison Dunbar possessed full testamentary capacity at the time his will was executed, that no undue influence was exerted upon him, and that his bequest to Miss Ashford represents the free and deliberate choice of a competent adult who understood the consequences of his actions." The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like a period at the end of a long sentence. Cordelia and Reginald Dunbar sat in stunned silence, while their expensive lawyer gathered his papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone already calculating his next appeal. But Nora barely heard the judge's words. She was thinking about 3 years of morning coffee and quiet conversation about the impossible gift of trust Harrison had placed in her hands. The money was hers now legally and finally, but more importantly, so was the responsibility that came with it. As she walked down the courthouse steps into the gray Portland afternoon, Harrison's pocket watch ticking steadily against her chest, Nora realized that winning the case had been the easy part. Now came the harder challenge, figuring out how to honor a dead man's faith in her character by becoming the person he'd believed her to be. The watch ticked once, twice, and she started walking not away from the courthouse, but toward whatever came next. 6 months after Judge Pierce's gavel fell, Fletcher's Corner Cafe looked the same from the outside, but felt completely different within. The familiar bell still chimed when customers entered. The coffee still smelled like salvation for the early morning crowd, and the mismatched tables still carried the stories of 1,000 conversations. But now, there were small changes that spoke of larger possibilities: new equipment that didn't break down, expanded hours that employed twice as many people, and a corner bulletin board where job training programs and community resources were posted alongside missing cat flyers. Nora stood behind the counter at 5:30 in the morning, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to gray light. In her hand, she held Harrison's pocket watch, not to check time, but because its weight had become a talisman, a reminder of choices made and responsibilities accepted. The Harrison Dunbar Foundation had been officially established for 3 months now, housed in the smallest suite she could find. No glass walls, no plaques, just a desk, a filing cabinet, and purpose. "You're here early again," Iris observed, emerging from the kitchen with fresh muffins. At 62, she moved with the same efficiency, but now with something lighter in her bearing, the relief of someone who no longer had to choose between paying rent and paying employees living wages. "Sleep's overrated," Nora replied, though success had brought its own form of insomnia, not desperate worry, but anxious stewardship. Each spreadsheet felt like a promise she couldn't afford to break. The Foundation's first programs had been modest job training, microloans, childcare support, simple ideas built on dignity rather than charity. But even small programs required constant attention and the kind of strategic thinking Nora had never imagined needing. She'd kept her job at Fletcher's Corner despite Bennett Crawford's suggestion that managing millions required full-time attention. The cafe anchored her to the world she understood, reminded her why Harrison's gift mattered. The morning rush brought familiar faces, but now Nora noticed differently. The postal worker wasn't just a customer, he was a potential board member for financial literacy programs. The retired teacher had become a volunteer coordinator. The neighborhood had evolved from backdrop to community. "Miss Nora." A young woman approached hesitantly, holding a thick folder. She was maybe 25, with careful appearance that suggested limited resources stretched to maximum effect. "I'm Maria Santos. I have an appointment about the small business loan program." Nora smiled, recognizing the nervous energy she'd felt walking into Crawford's office months ago. "Let's sit down and talk." She gestured toward Harrison's old corner table, transformed from monument to workspace for foundation business. Maria's dream was modest, but carefully planned: a food truck specializing in her grandmother's recipes. She'd done research, understood her market, calculated profit margins. What she lacked was $5,000 for equipment and permits, a small amount that represented an impossible barrier without collateral. "I know it's not much," Maria said, spreading her business plan with trembling hands. "But I've been working in restaurant kitchens for 8 years. I know I can make this work. I just need someone to believe in me." The phrase hit Nora with unexpected force. Someone to believe in me. Exactly what Harrison had given her: not just money, but faith that she could become more than circumstances suggested. They spent an hour reviewing Maria's plan. By the time they finished, Maria had preliminary approval and clear understanding of reporting expectations. The board would need final approval, but Nora felt confident about the recommendation. "Thank you," Maria said as they shook hands. "You don't know what this means." But Nora did know, because she'd felt the same overwhelmed gratitude 6 months ago. The afternoon brought David Martinez, who'd become both compass and ballast in the unpredictable sea of nonprofit work. He settled into the booth with the comfortable ease of someone who'd become family through crisis rather than blood. "How's our reluctant philanthropist today?" he asked, signaling Iris for coffee. "Tired," Nora admitted. "But I'm tired. We approved 3 more loans this week, and job training has a waiting list." "That's success," David confirmed. "Harrison would be proud." They reviewed quarterly reports discussing expansion and sustainability. The money was substantial but not infinite, and Nora had insisted every program be designed to become self-supporting over time. "There's something else," David said, his tone shifting to a careful register. He slid a folded newspaper across the table. The headlines told the rest. "Cordelia and Reginald have dropped their appeal." Nora looked up from financial statements, surprised by her own lack of reaction. 6 months ago, this would have felt like vindication. Now it seemed almost irrelevant, a legal footnote to a story that had moved beyond their grievances. I suppose they realized they couldn't win. That, and they've been busy with their own problems. Reginald's company is facing bankruptcy, and Cordelia's firm lost major clients after the trial publicity. David's smile held no malice, just satisfaction of karma working efficiently. As evening approached, Nora found herself alone with Iris, counting receipts and planning tomorrow's specials. The same routine she'd followed for years, but now carrying additional weight. "Do you ever regret it?" Iris asked suddenly. "Taking on all this responsibility? You could have taken their settlement, lived comfortably without the stress." The question was one Nora had asked herself countless times during long nights when foundation business kept her awake. But the answer had never changed. "No," she said simply. "Harrison didn't leave me money to make my life easier. He left it to make other people's lives possible. That's a privilege, not a burden." She glanced at the cafe clock, an echo of the mornings when he'd been her first customer. 7:15, exactly when Harrison used to arrive. The synchronicity felt intentional, as if the universe was reminding her that some patterns transcended individual lives. The foundation had received its first major donation request that week, a homeless services organization needing funding for a new shelter. The amount was substantial, more than they'd ever committed to a single project. But their proposal was solid, their need undeniable. Tomorrow, she would present the proposal to the Foundation's board: David, Mrs. Laura, and Tommy, and 3 other community members who understood what it meant to need help and be denied it. They'd been voted in under Oregon nonprofit law, though most still met in the cafe between shifts. They would evaluate the request based on evidence rather than emotion, sustainability rather than sentiment. But tonight, she was just Nora Ashford, closing Fletcher's Corner at the end of another ordinary day. She wiped down Harrison's old table one final time, straightened chairs, and turned off lights. Outside, Portland's downtown was settling into the evening rhythm. As she locked the front door and headed toward her car, Nora caught her reflection in the cafe's window and barely recognized the woman looking back. 6 months of responsibility had changed her in ways beyond new clothes. There was something in her bearing now that spoke of authority earned rather than inherited, confidence built through trial rather than gifted through accident. The Foundation's work would continue tomorrow and the day after, and for as long as the money lasted and needed. But more importantly, it would continue, because the idea behind it that everyone deserved to be seen, valued, and given a chance had taken root in ways that transcended any individual fortune. She started her car and pulled into Portland's evening traffic, already planning tomorrow's work. The homeless shelter proposal would need careful review before the board meeting. Maria's food truck application required final documentation. 3 more loan interviews were scheduled for next week, each representing someone's carefully guarded dream, waiting for the chance to become reality. Behind her, Fletcher's Corner sat quiet and ready for another day of small kindnesses and ordinary miracles. The Foundation office 2 blocks away held files that represented dozens of lives already changed, businesses, launched jobs, created families, stabilized. But the real work happened here, in the daily interactions that reminded her why Harrison's experiment had mattered in the first place. Tomorrow would bring new faces, new stories, new opportunities to prove that dignity wasn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The Foundation would grow carefully and deliberately, expanding its reach without losing sight of its core mission. And somewhere in the space between what was and what could be, Harrison Dunbar's legacy continued to grow, 1 cup of coffee, 1 conversation, 1 chance at dignity at a time. The cafe lights faded behind her, their glow spilling into the wet street like a promise made visible. Portland was waking again, and so was she.